On this Bell Let's Talk Day, millions of Canadians have been using the opportunity to talk, text, and tweet about the importance of mental health and keeping an open dialogue, an open mind, all the issues that go around it. Well, our guest tonight is one of a great many people who wish that dialogue continued all year long. Dr. Simon Sherry is a registered psychologist and an associate professor at Dalhousie's Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, and we are delighted to welcome you to the program on this very important day. Thanks so much for coming in tonight, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
When we asked you what topics you wanted to cover this evening, you immediately brought up PTSD. Why is that?
It's a vitally important issue to all Canadians. It's a common, costly, and impairing form of mental health problem that will affect as many as 7 to 9% of Canadian adults.
I think most Canadians know PTSD stands for Posttraumatic Stress Disorder. For those who don't know the definition, what is it exactly?
It begins with exposure to some sort of a traumatic event, which can involve actual or threatened serious injury or even death. And after exposure to a traumatic event, there's often a lot of what we could call re-experiencing, where the event replays in the individual's mind. PTSD is often associated with avoidance, where an individual will try and escape or withdraw from situations that remind them of the traumatic event. There's also a lot of what we could call hyperarousal in PTSD, where the individual is keyed up, jittery, nervous, on edge physiologically. They're just very tense. And finally, PTSD is also an assault on how a person views him or herself, the world, and other people within it. Oftentimes after a traumatic event, human cognition shifts in a much darker direction.
Is there any particular group, profession might be more susceptible to PTSD?
It's well known that some professions are exposed to trauma much more often. Examples would be combat veterans.
Military.
Sure. Absolutely. Other first responders such as police officers or paramedics. Anyone who puts himself on the line on a day-to-day basis is sadly more at risk for PTSD.
I think back in history, and we think back to World War I, the First World War, and we've all seen those pictures of soldiers. Back then they called it shell shock. Would that have been what was, maybe the name PTSD wasn't around then, but would that have been what these people were dealing with?
PTSD was only formally recognized as a diagnosis in North America in 1980, but I do think ideas like shell shock were precursors to what we now call PTSD today.
We often, as you say, associate it with someone who's experienced some deep emotional trauma, physical danger or threat, but not everyone who goes through that develops PTSD. So what's the difference?
Unfortunately, most adults in North America have been exposed to some sort of a traumatic event. So your question is a great one. If we've got somewhere between 65 and 70% of people who have encountered a trauma, why is it that only a minority, maybe 7 to 9%, go on to develop PTSD? First of all, I think that has nothing to do with any sort of weakness or defectiveness. Oftentimes it has to do with the social support surrounding an individual after a trauma. Or it may have to do with the structure and function of an individual's brain. For example, being born into the world with an amygdala that works different than a so-called normal person.
Sorry, a what?
An amygdala is known as the fear center in the brain, and it's closely implicated in PTSD. And you and I have no more choice over that than we do the shape of our head or the size of our feet. And yet, if a veteran were to roll out into combat with an amygdala or a hippocampus that is somewhat different than someone else's, they're going to be more at risk to develop PTSD.
Your particular field of expertise is the role of personality traits and psychopathology, things like perfectionism. And in some cases, those are linked to things like depression and binge eating. It's interesting how some of these traits might be considered desirable in some circumstances. You know, if you've got a worker who's a perfectionist, that would probably be a good thing. Yet, on the other hand, they can lead to other issues, I suppose, for the person themselves.
When it comes to something like PTSD, we do know that certain temperaments, like having a basic emotional instability in your personality, seems to place you at risk for the development of PTSD over time.
As someone who has studied this for as long as you have, is there less stigma now around some of these issues than there was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, do you think?
Absolutely, and I think we can in part thank initiatives like today for helping to destigmatize various forms of mental illness. At the same time, I think we have an awfully long way to go.
We still do.
Absolutely.
So how important is Bell Let's Talk Day then?
I think it's important. It also leaves us with 364 days uncovered. And as much as it is important to talk, I also believe it's important to fight. When something like PTSD comes into your life, comes into your house, it means that a thief and a killer are in your house. PTSD is a thief in that it steals from people joy, satisfaction, connection with others. At its worst, it can demoralize them and take their life away. And PTSD is also a killer in that it makes people more likely to think about suicide, more likely to attempt suicide. And PTSD is also linked with suicide completion, probably because it leads to things like depression that really place people at risk. So while talking is enormously important, I think we also need to fight against something like PTSD, because when it comes into your house, it's a real danger.
It sure is. That's the absolute perfect place to leave it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. Dr. Simon Cherry, a registered psychologist and associate professor at Dalhousie's Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. Happy that he joined us on this Bell Let's Talk Day. And don't forget, there is still lots of time to talk, text, and tweet to support mental health programs in this country. Stay with us. We'll be right back.